When I went into Bioshock 2, I high-key expected it to be a fundamentally different experience from the first game. I mistakenly got the impression that it is so relatively, maligned on account of failing to be what the first game was. But the irony is that that impression is, well, exactly right. I just interpreted it wrong, because when I played this game, and it was in all of the most important ways, almost the exact same game, I was shocked. In some ways, it is more refined and convenient gameplay experience than the original was, and in that way I can actually sympathize with the people who enjoy Bioshock 2 more than the first game. But the gameplay is not the only part of the experience. While I honestly love the gameplay loop of the games, it was the story and the writing of the original that made it stand out so much. More than that, it features a twist in it that lands so perfectly that nobody who played through that game has forgotten it. It's impossible to. It is too reality bending. It's impossible to even experience the opening of that game without the ramifications of the twist being noticed in ways that were so easily overlooked before. To call that moment and everything surrounding its construction and reveal genius is somehow an understatement. It is truly something special. So the thing that needed to impress me about Bioshock 2, considering it's damn near the exact same game, as I mentioned, was the story. Unfortunately, its opening isn't much of anything special, and the entire first half of the game beyond, maybe even the whole first 2/3, is just a straight up nothing burger that fails to be very meaningful, with NPCs that fail to live up to any of those from the first game. The last few levels are pretty good, and the ending of the game is arguably more emotionally resonant, impactful, and good than the ending of the first game, but without so much extra oomph building it up. It feels almost as empty as it does meaningful somehow. A further damning feature of Bioshock 2 is that its DLC, with less than half of the runtime, maybe even only 1/3 of the runtime, manages to pack more punch and be more interesting than it. I'd almost recommend people to play said DLC titled Minerva's Den and just ignore the base game. It is separate, and it is paced better from a gameplay standpoint as well, just overall a much tighter experience. I still recommend the game as a whole for fans, but just be aware of what exactly you're getting into here. You're just playing more Bioshock, but you're not going to be grabbed by the story or writing as much, nor are you going to see anything substantially new or expansive about the gameplay. Some minor story spoilers for Bioshocks 1 and 2 will feature in this section of the review. See the time code on screen to, skip that. The biggest weakness of Bioshock 2's story is that, despite very clearly trying to follow up its predecessor, it decides to introduce new characters and implicit plot beats in accordance to the original story, and, importantly, the history of Rapture, that are so obviously intended to be broadly spanning, but because they are never mentioned at all in the first game, it feels less like an expansion and more like retconning in a sense. Lamb's character is the very first example, but there's a lot more to it. The combat between Atlas/Fontaine and Ryan is referenced a few times, but Bioshock 2 tries to treat the political battle between Lamb and Ryan as this all-encompassing issue that has defined Rapture for a long time. Unfortunately, this central conceit fails to land, making the first half of the game a really sour take on the IP. It felt forced to me. Even Tenenbaum's role in the game, which seemed like it'd be somewhat prominent, may as well have not existed in the end, and so my overall investment was rather low from the get-go. But more than just the core of the story here and how Lamb and her family, as you start to put together over time, especially in the last few levels, play into it, a huge chunk of the game is about you dealing with a few major NPCs in one form or another. There's a degree to which this is somewhat reminiscent of the first game, but the characters are somehow not as memorable to me. they should be, though. I mean, one of them is all up on Lamb's propaganda regarding Big Daddies, and you, the player character in particular. Another is a dude who leaves behind audio logs designed to allow you to take him out, as he knows he is going crazy and likely doing some crazy shit by the time you actually encounter him. I enjoyed these sections of the game while doing them, but they don't really serve any broader narrative purpose, and that left me disappointed. Ultimately, what loses me with the story is that it tries to do this reaching political thriller of sorts, with you as a seemingly unwitting Big Daddy inexplicably at the center of it all, but the pieces of the political puzzle don't really fit together, and they don't really add to the puzzle that was Bioshock 1 either, despite wanting to. None of it ends up really mattering, because the point of the story is actually the more personal side of it, the familial side. Here is where we go into pretty major spoilers for a little bit. Again, use the timestamp that you see on screen to skip out of the story section here. You, the player character, are turned into a Big Daddy and bonded with a little sister named Eleanor. The girl is at the center of the plot, for she is the one that Lamb is trying to turn into a perfectly selfless vessel to bring forth utopia. She is Lamb's daughter, and though the determination of whether you personally are Eleanor's literal father, you fill that role for all intents and purposes. Eleanor goes so far as to refer to you as father throughout the game, for example, and Lamb's antagonism towards you also comes across as strangely wife-coded to me, but that's completely irrelevant. Anyway, Eleanor's guiding you to save her is really her managing to break free from the stranglehold of Lamb so that she can, actually be a normal person with a personality and not just be a robot, not some empty shell used by some other hack. There is an edge of the political in Lamb's motivations that I think are interesting, but it's really that personal story at the heart of it that makes the game turn out okay. The last few levels are finally genuinely centered on your saving of Eleanor, your daughter effectively, and her finding a way to let you survive with her after escaping Rapture. I found the way Bioshock 2 handled this dynamic surprisingly touching and compelling. I just wish there was a little bit more direct development of it in the first half of the game, and more so that the first half of the game wasn't so worried instead about these side characters and stupid fetch questing. End of plot spoilers here, by the way. You're free to watch the rest of the video in peace. My chief complaint with the game is the way that the level design and story structure coalesce into this little ball of nothingness that fails to deliver on its goals without feeling or straight up being pointless. As one of my buddies commented when I first posted in a private Discord server about how I thought the first half of the game was pretty mid, he said, Bioshock 2 suffers because the entire game is, oh, the door in front of you that leads to interesting plot is broken, please spend 2 hours going around. He's not entirely wrong. To Bioshock 2's credit, splitting the game into separate levels so effectively and making them non-revisitable is great from the standpoint of ease, but the lack of cohesion between them is felt a bit too strongly, and the fact that you can't go back at any point reduces the amount of connection or importance they have in your mind. Sure, there were parts of Bioshock that were borderline frustrating if you happened to miss little details, and some of that was on account of backtracking and stuff that you might have done during the experience, but I felt like as a player I developed an inherent connection to Rapture and where different places actually led to. By contrast, Bioshock 2 never leaves much impact because the areas basically don't mean anything until the last couple chapters, where some of the conceptual ideas regarding Eleanor and the little sisters, pokes through to shift the way Rapture is depicted, for lack of a better term. Furthermore, as mentioned previously, this sequel tries to make the early areas memorable by giving you some quest or other based around an NPC as you make your way towards Persephone, but these quests they simply fall flat. The NPCs are eccentric and memorable on paper, but the exact reason you're doing any of this is rather nebulous. It serves more to world build and lay out political aspects of Rapture. things that occurred in the years in between the two games, or hell, even before the first game oftentimes, just don't ever strike as real or plausible because of the issue of supposedly notable conflicts that were never discussed in, let alone relevant to the first game's plot. As the player, I found myself far more often wondering if I was crazy and had forgotten things in the granted 5 years since I played Bioshock, but no, it's just random stuff that I should be interested in, but can't be because I eternally feel like I'm being gaslit. Anyway, these little side tasks for NPCs don't really do much for me, and when each one of them is only done for the purpose of being able to move your ride along further into Rapture, yeah, I think you get the picture. If the stories of each level aren't doing anything to move the needle, and the completely disconnected level design completely breaks my immersion as a result, a fault that could be levied at the first game if their design and pacing weren't so good, surely the gameplay must be innovative, right? Right? Given that I plan to re-review Bioshock in a critical analysis format, and to incorporate Bioshock 2 as part of that script, I won't go too deep into the mechanics in this video. Suffice it to say that if you've played the first game, you've also played this game for better and for worse. As I believe I already mentioned, I kind of expected Bioshock 2 to be a notable departure from a gameplay side of things, and I was very surprised that it is damn near no different. The weapons you use are superficially different, and that they're the same classes, like shotgun, full auto machine gun, etc. Even the research camera is carried over. The plasmid selection at your disposal is basically identical as far as I can tell, which makes sense. That said, the conceit of being a big daddy and playing the game essentially the same way as Jack has a manner of cognitive dissonance inherent to it. I mean, you get the drill as part of your kit for your melee attacks in the game, your primary melee build, but it can hardly be considered a true expansion of the formula. Having played the demo of Grime 2 recently, I was struck by its immediate differences from the first game in the gameplay. The identity, all its own, it manages to immediately form without giving up any of the core of what the original did. Bioshock 2, at the time I played, and certainly now in hindsight with that relative comparison in mind, does nothing of the sort. That said, there are a couple of degrees to which Bioshock 2 arguably improves upon the standard gameplay loop. I mean, my favorite thing about Bioshock 2's base game experience is that you don't inherently have to switch between your physical weapon and your plasmids like your own personal tennis match. Instead, you can wield both simultaneously. This is so nice. I had forgotten how tedious that was in the first game until I no longer had to deal with it. This is the one way in which being a big daddy actively affects the way you utilize your kit, and it's pretty great. Otherwise, everything else is the same, or cut out in the case of mechanics like ammo crafting, which is no real loss, but worth noting. You explore the world the same way, you come across the same kinds of enemies, but you don't get the pleasure of having them introduced to you in memorable ways. Seriously, remember how unsettling the first splicers at the beginning were? Remember how legitimately terrifying the spider splicers were when first encountering them in Arcadia? Bioshock 2 just kind of randomly includes the enemy types here and there without any real direction, and you, the player, just have to realize, wait a minute, that guy's different. What the hell's that about? Anyway, the level design and enemy encounters aren't really much of anything special for the most part. You just kind of play the game to get to the next part. And these are basically the only things to really say about the broader gameplay of Bioshock 2. It is a recreation of the first game to a fault, deigning not to take any courageous swings to really adapt or iterate. The only addition to the general gameplay loop is the way little sisters are handled, and even that's not by much, given you're being a big daddy, but even this is optional and by no means truly innovative. In the first game, you beat a big daddy, you rescue the little sister, or harvest her if you're a sicko, and pretty simple as that. In Bioshock 2, you do basically the same thing, except now you have the option to use her to fulfill some holdout mission style sequences where she actively garners Adam from corpses for you before you take her back to one of the chutes. You don't have to, as I accidentally realized halfway through, but it gives you some freedom whether you want or need the extra Adam. Not a bad idea. And overall, it's a better way to do what Bioshock 1 did with its little escort mission excursion before facing Fontaine. I respect them at least trying something to be a little different from the bulk of the first game, but even that first game had you turn into a Big Daddy and do said escort mission, so is it really that different? I'd argue it's not. And combined with basically no enticing story decisions that managed to stick out like the first game did, I found myself disappointed as a whole. Besides, even with this tiny expansion, with using the little sisters to gather Adam, the only time you'd really want to harvest Adam is like once for every 2 or 3 saved sisters, assuming you want to save them at all, considering that the single new enemy in the game, the Big Sisters, are like fighting another Big Daddy, but worse because they move quick. Yeah, I guess I forgot to mention up to this point that there is one new enemy type, and she is introduced pretty well, actually. It's one of the few things that Bioshock 2 does objectively correctly. It's crazy that I forgot about it up until now. Yeah, if you save too many little sisters, a big sister will come after you. It doesn't matter what you got going on, they'll fuck your shit up if you save a little sister at the wrong time, as I basically did at a couple of points. One time I was in the middle of a big combat encounter when one came after me, and another time I think I remember fighting one right after I had just spent basically all my resources having to kill a Big Daddy who set his sights on me after another enemy I was fighting shot him. So, to be fair, I'll give Bioshock 2 credit for the Big Sisters. I'll give it credit for letting me use plasmids and weapons without having to switch back and forth. I'll give it credit for having a decently evocative story in the last few levels. Beyond these things, Bioshock 2 doesn't really do too much to be anywhere near what the original was. And it's not like I expected it to be as good as 1, but it still disappointed. It's just so ironic that a game so similar to its predecessor can be so much more mediocre. But that's enough about the base game. Let me change tack and briefly discuss what is hands down the best part of this entire experience, and that's the DLC. Minerva's Den is the distillation of what Bioshock 2 could have been and should have been. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like the ultimate story of Bioshock 2 enough for what it is, by the time it decides to be engaging, but a lot of its thematic backdrop and commentary is reliant upon the first games in ways that feel unnatural and janky. The main villain supposedly being some great opposition of Andrew Ryan, but never being mentioned in the original title is just a little bit too much to overlook. There's an emotional resonance to the sequel that I won't deny exists, but I deny that it is very effective for most of the game's runtime, a fact made more awkward when you consider that Bioshock 2 took me like 6 hours less time to play. Minerva's Den, by contrast, decides to tell a story nearly entirely separate, in a setting that is also, for all intents and purposes, separate from the primary body of Rapture. Sure, it still manages to force Tenenbaum in, which I find rather odd, even if it does make sense given the Big Daddy / Little Sister dynamic still being a thing, but despite this minor thing that I'm not 100% sure about, Tenenbaum being used as a parking cone rather than actually participating in the plot, a problem shared by the base game and this DLC, I think that Minerva's Den has a resonance that is arguably even more impactful today than it would have been 15 years ago. I won't explain why because of spoiler reasons. I think this story is actually worth experiencing blind if you can, like I did. It's memorable, has some unexpected developments, and uses the combination of twist and conceit to build an experience that reminds of the way that the original Bioshock did. It's not that drastic and doesn't have anywhere near as big ramifications, but the DLC is just a few hours long, and only a couple areas large. Considering this, I'd say it packs a hefty punch, all things considered. And the gameplay of Minerva's Den is nearly identical to the base game, except you get one new weapon, the ion laser, and that's pretty fun, and there's one new Big Daddy type to face, which poses a little bit more of an active threat rather than, a kind of cheap one. Between these little things, its ramped up pacing that somehow manages to be natural and the engaging and surprising story decisions, I just overall had a really enjoyable time with the DLC in a way the base game largely fails to compete with. Comparatively, I want to replay the DLC out of principle and to get to experience its writing with new eyes after having finished it. The main game, I only want to play it again to get the Platinum Trophy, and even that's a little bit of a question mark for me at the time of producing this video. Or is it? Hi, Future KC here, amped to be redoing the end of this review. You see, I had originally closed by saying the following. To close out the review, let's just say the best way to summarize my feelings on this sequel is to say that I am yet uncertain if I'm going to go for Platinum. I think I probably will, but it's certainly not like the first game where I just continued playing because I couldn't resist the urge. Well, I did ultimately decide to replay Bioshock 2 on hard mode with Vita chambers turned off to try to get as many of the remaining trophies as possible. I did that about a week after recording the bulk of this review. I'm recording this addendum like 2.5 months after recording the original version of the review and about 2 months after doing said replay. Well, I had a largely different experience this time around with the game. Though having no Vita chambers made parts of it pretty tedious at times, especially with a couple of loading bugs where if my PS4 was struggling to connect to the internet, the game would freeze for like 5 to 10 minutes before starting. But overall, the way that I inherently had to care more about my loadout, both of the weapon and plasmid variety, made the experience a lot more engaging, and therefore essentially fun. I did have a scare where I only needed to research like 2 final Houdini splicers, I think, for the full research trophy upon entering the final areas without having realized I actually had meters in the game that told me how full each research bar was, and that was scary because I thought I'd have to do a third playthrough on easy or something due to the technicality just to, get that research trophy, but thankfully that wasn't the case. I wasted about 2 hours trying to fully research the only enemies I didn't know if I had yet on previous saves, like the Big Daddy, as far as I could immediately tell seemed like the one, but once I realized it was a basic enemy that I could complete in Persephone, I was able to just finish the game as planned after that. It was also a huge relief to me that I got some of the miscellaneous trophies in the hard run, dispelling the need to do a third run on easy. Trophies such as not taking damage while a little sister gathers Adam, I thought I'd for sure be unable to do. By the way, I recommend this particular corpse that I'm showing in gameplay footage right now for this trophy. I nearly got the trophy on my Let's Play run at this very corpse, and I intentionally made it the spot I tried in hard just in case. Definitely a solid defensible spot for both yourself and for the little sister. It's great. My critique of hard mode is that even playing through it this way, you have enough weapons at your disposal by the end of the game that generally speaking, it's not super tough in the last couple of chapters, so the precise difficulty balancing from early game to end game isn't precisely tuned in my opinion. It's too hard at first and too easy at the end. But I guess that's the benefit of a game where you slowly get more powerful this way. At the same time, I actually got worse at utilizing all of my tools, particularly where plasmids were concerned, just as I did the first time, specifically because of the game getting easier meant that I wasn't having to think as hard about what I was doing. Again, the tuning isn't quite precise enough for my liking, but I'm not even sure I could say any different about the original game, especially not when the original has a new game plus where you can basically curb stomp everything the entire time. So, my ultimate final thoughts on Bioshock 2, now that I've played it on hard, are essentially that I find it somewhat frustrating at several points compared to the first game. In my first playthrough, this was largely because I wasn't utilizing the full sandbox of the game on account of doing a Let's Play, rather than the way I might have typically been inclined to go through it. The way that I ultimately did on my second playthrough. It seemed at the time like the kind of frustrating that would make a hard mode not worth it. Instead, it was the opposite, but had its own frustrating aspect of not being tuned well enough to retain what makes it work better than the normal difficulty all the way through. In general, I'm not huge on difficulty trophies, but occasionally one is actually worth getting, and I'd say Bioshock 2 was essentially one of those experiences. I would have liked it even more without the Vita chambers turned off too, so I almost recommend you make your first time the hard mode, then do cleanup on something else if you want. But with all of that being said, the very last paragraph of my original review remains accurate, and so I'll cut back to past KC to end the review for you. In the end, the disappointing fact of the matter is that I did not love Bioshock 2. I anticipated enjoying it, and I broadly did, but it is a tale of full-scale whelming for a whole 2/3 of the runtime or so before it actually gets good. It doesn't have a proper boss fight to seal the experience. The technical twists of the story, I'm pretty sure, aren't twists, they're just regular old story developments. But they're framed like the game wants them to be twists because the first game had such a memorable one. The gameplay is certainly not bad, but it basically takes no steps to be its own thing. It relies too heavily on the previous title, and its DLC manages to be better than it. These are all very concerning things. Bioshock 2 is not a bad game at all, but it fails to be a great one either.